We got two really interesting guests for you guys. They're survivors of the Parkland shooting down in Florida. Samantha Fuentes is an activist now, and Cameron Kasky, of course, was one of the co-founders of Never Again and March for Our Lives. Those are the groups that, of course, rose up after that shooting in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Sam and Cam, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no problem. So Sam, I want to start with you. You guys are in a movie, Us Kids. It's coming out on May 14th. And Sam, you couldn't join the original protest because you were in the hospital. You got shot 4 times? No?
No.
You got hit. Where did you get hit? Let me ask it in the form of a question. Where did you get hit when you got shot?
Yeah, I was shot one time just above my left knee, and then I have multiple locations of shrapnel in both my legs, my arm, and my face.
That's where I'm getting confused. Yeah, the shrapnel in your face and the arms, right? And so, did you think you were going to die, Sam?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and look, you talk about it in the movie, but for the purpose of the audience that haven't seen the movie, how much does it traumatize you still to this day?
Every single day. I think there's just new obstacles and new triggers that I figure out about myself when I progress further in my life. You know, I think there isn't really a single day that I don't think about that occasion. And every day is just a new learning opportunity to adapt in a world that really doesn't care too much about, your mental health. So.
So Cam, you helped to co-found Never Again and March for Our Lives. So everybody was so hopeful at that moment. We had this horrible tragedy. Everybody's super depressed, and then you kids rise up out of this tragedy and fight back. And it was like one of the most amazing things we've seen. That's why it wasn't just the tragedy, because unfortunately we've had dozens, if not hundreds, of massacres, right? And so we remember that because it was about the kids, but it was also because of your reaction. So, but this is a real earnest question. Now, this many years later, looking back on it, how do you feel about it? How do you think that it's made a difference? And how do you feel about the politics of it, et cetera?
Well, I think the impact is definitely something that everybody is very happy about, because really, especially in the beginning, all we cared about was making sure that the whole country was able to understand how preventable that tragedy was. There had been so many mass shootings at schools before that were all very different. The students were often very young. A lot of the mass shootings happened in public spaces that were not very small, unified towns. But in Parkland, we were high schoolers. We had been talking about mass shootings. We discussed the shooting in Las Vegas in a class I was in, where we had a class member who we unfortunately lost during the shooting. So we were high schoolers who had discussed the politics of this, and suddenly it happens, and we want to get in front of the cameras and say, hey, everyone, instead of filming a bunch of crying white moms, maybe we can let the kids tell you just how easy this was to stop. But right now, this very moment is a very complicated time for gun violence prevention activists, because with Biden in the White House, the media does not want to aid us in demanding stronger gun reforms, because whatever Joe Biden does is suddenly the right thing to do. When Donald Trump was the president, calling for an assault weapons ban and saying that the measures that he was putting in place were not nearly enough was a very popular opinion. Now, if you're calling for an assault weapons ban, suddenly you're just an angry leftist who will never be happy with anything. So that's kind of the case across the board with activists in this time of the Biden era. Anything that their administration is willing to do is the popular thing. And if you ask for even a little bit more racial justice in the way we fight gun violence, more healthcare in the way we fight gun violence, because gun violence is obviously so rooted in racial issues and healthcare and policing, well, now we're the bad guys because we're complaining too much and we aren't happy enough with all the great things President Biden is giving us. It's tough. And I think it was definitely, you had a much easier time calling for changes when Trump was the president, because everybody wanted to help you stick it to the old orange man.
Yeah, Cam, you just said something super interesting. I mean, that's exactly why we were energized by your movement when it first started, because you guys were saying things that adults found to be unacceptable. And a lot of us thought, I can't curse, but hell yeah, right? And so tell me more about that, because it resonates with me when you say, oh, now you can't say anything against Biden. That resonates completely, because I do a news show where we actually do the actual news and not the BS news. But where do you get that reaction? How do you feel that? Who are you getting that reaction from?
Well, look, there is a lot of meaningful debate about guns on the left, because there are leftists who will go out and say, look, disarming the working class is a very bad thing. We need the working class to be able to defend themselves from the very many oppressive forces of the government that exist. And I understand people who say that kind of thing. I understand why, people in communities of color will say, why are you trying to disarm us when we are the enemy of the police and the police is targeting us? Now, of course, the natural response, especially in communities of color, is if you are armed and a police officer messes with you, they will use that as an excuse to do whatever they want instantly. But there's a lot of nuance to the gun debate on the left. Now, the more you get to the center and the more you say, hey, Biden administration, both President Biden and Vice President Harris campaigned on assault weapons bans and much stronger reforms than this. It's what everybody expected. Everybody knew after Biden got the nomination that if he won, if we were able to come together and defeat Donald Trump, then this was going to be 4 years of half measures and softballs from a policy perspective. And suddenly we've got the president playing defense, and suddenly the left is the enemy, and our job is to unite with the right. Now, if we had a president calling for unity between the center and the left, that would be a wonderful thing, because I think there's a lot of great work to be done to unify the center and the left. But nope, all anybody cares about is unifying the center left, which is obviously becoming so much more like the center right, and the right, which is becoming proto-fascism, if not full fascism.
First of all, #truth. Second of all, we got to get more young people on the program, because older people are so full of crap, and they grew up on brainwashed cable news pulp, whereas you guys are actually speaking things that are obviously true. So Sam, let's talk about the younger generation, right? So now you've got to interact, because of this unique experience, with so many others that are in your generation, and unfortunately so many others that have suffered. So what's your takeaway on the future? So I think Cam is right about the present. It sucks, and it's going to be very hard to change. But how about the future? Are you hopeful that the younger generation just thinks completely differently than the older generation? That might lead to change?
Well, yes, I would say that I'm optimistic. Am I still cynical? Absolutely. When it comes to the discussion of gun violence prevention, it feels like it comes in trends, unfortunately, and the trend is usually followed by a new shooting. However, I feel in regards to gun violence, the conversation is gearing towards probably 3 of the most important things, which is culture, education, and legislation. Culture in regards to how America tends to fetishize violence, especially gun violence specifically, having more conversations on why we tend to turn to violence rather to conversation. Education in regards to how to, properly store a firearm, or how to, report community members who might be dangerous to themselves and others. And legislation, we're talking more about, finally, universal background checks. We're talking about red flag laws, in states across the nation. And so when it comes to hope, that comes from action. And when you see changes in regards to people's response to shootings, that's how you know that things are changing. Because now I think people are more apprehensive, because they are starting to associate those statistics with human lives. And that's really the hope of this film, is that it sheds light on this generation that is unfortunately going to be affected by gun violence for who knows how long. And it sheds light on this reality in hopes that it will connect with people and inspire them to want to do something and create some substantial change. And that's what people like myself and Cam are just fighting for, so we can live in an America that's safer and more fair for everybody.
Sam, in the movie, when you talk about Nick and you guys sing happy birthday to your classmate who died, it's impossible not to cry. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this concept, and of course you shouldn't, and you all know that. But do you wind up having survivor's guilt?
I certainly do, just because people like to frame me up so much as a survivor when, considering where I was during the shooting, I could have comfortably mixed a margarita and been completely safe. I was well over 100 yards away from the violence. And look, I immediately after the shooting was saying, "Oh, I'm a survivor. I'm a mass shooting survivor." But there were students, obviously, like Sam and so many others, who went through traumatic events that day. And I very often like to say that a lot of the trauma that Parkland students face was not so much the exact events of the shooting, but the horrific things that happened in the community afterwards. It was the media circus. It was the way everything was handled. And, again, I think that there was a very toxic side of the public conversation that would frame up myself and other activists as survivors of something that we were more nearby for, because of the fetishization, a word that I always struggle getting out, the fetishization of white pain in this country. When white kids are suffering and crying, the media will jump at it, and the wider audiences can really bank on that kind of thing. So people like me who were not facing the violence in any real way were, they were trying to get as much pain out of us as possible, because that was the fuel of the mass shooting media circuit. And that's been the case since, before even Columbine. It's all white kids crying and feeling pain. So let's try to extract as much trauma as we can out of students, even when they were, like I was, safe.
Yeah, well, and then do nothing about it, which is what is infuriating.
Nothing about it. That's the given. That's the given here, is doing nothing about it. That applies to every issue.
Yeah, and look, and you're 100 yards is not that far from it, but I understand exactly what you're saying. But Sam, look, last thing, the reason I brought up survivor's guilt is because it seems like if you have it, you guys are trying to make something positive out of it. And Sam, if you wind up getting some of this legislation passed, the federal background checks are so weak that doesn't, it's not anywhere near good enough. But if you get an assault weapons ban or something along those lines, does it at least feel like, hey, at least we did something with our pain?
Absolutely. This is what they would have wanted, for me to turn my trauma into power, to really take the reins onto something and see it go into fruition. There isn't a day that goes by where I wonder why it wasn't me instead of them, And so to feel less guilty, I suppose this is what I do to heal, to work. And it's just because I would never want anyone to have to experience that suffering and that pain ever again. And that's why we say never again, because that kind of pain is so long lasting. One quick moment, one decisive move changes an entire generation, an entire livelihood of one person, of one community, of one state. And people don't understand the long lasting effects. And that's why we fight so hard, because gun violence shouldn't be an issue for anybody, especially for the young and the defenseless. And to go back to what Cameron was saying is that, we absolutely infantilize and absolutely fetishize, mass shootings. But when it comes to, black and brown bodies on the floor, they're demonized as being savages and being a part of their own culture, that they're hurting themselves. But it's all violence at the end of the day, and it all needs to come to an end. And films like this offer visibility, offers representation in times where the media absolutely turns their backs on people who are affected by gun violence every single day, not in just specific, really, really small percentages like myself who've experienced gun violence. We need to start talking about every single day gun violence. We need to start talking about police brutality. We need to start talking about suicides. We need to start talking about everything, instead of just letting it slide by and then wonder why it keeps happening, because it angers me to no end. I have more words than anger, that's for sure, but it needs to come to an end.
Well, it should anger you. So look, we gotta go, but number one, your point about violence is so true. And society, our society usually, after committing the violence, says those people only understand violence after committing it, right? And so that's usually how it goes. And look, obviously you have nothing to feel guilty about, you know that. Logically, you know that. I know that emotionally it feels different. But Sam, the other part that made me tear up in the movie was when you were talking about your friend who had died. I thought, you got shot, and if you had died, they would have forgotten about you. Your friends wouldn't have, right? But the government would have, the people in charge would have. And it just reminded me again and again how callous our government has become and our society has become. And so the fact that you guys are still fighting and not letting us forget about what happened there and the people you lost, I tell you from my perspective, I can't thank you enough. So Samantha Fuentes, Cameron Kasky, thank you guys. Appreciate it.